The fog tastes different in Northern California when you know what happened there. Metallic, almost like copper on the tongue. The redwoods remember things we've tried to forget, their roots drinking from soil that once absorbed screams disguised as science, prayers mistaken for psychosis. Somewhere between San Francisco's Victorian basements and the mist-shrouded forests of the coast, there are still echoes, not the kind you can record. The kind that burrow into your bones and make you question what consciousness really is, whether your thoughts have ever truly been your own. 1953. The year the world held its breath between wars, when the enemy wasn't just across the ocean, but inside the mind itself. Dr. Elias Thorne stood in a basement laboratory that smelled of ether and ambition, his reflection fractured across glass vials containing substances with no names yet, only designations. LSD 25. Compound X, the keys to the kingdom, or so they'd promised him when the men in gray suits appeared at his university office with manila folders stamped in red. The fluorescent lights flickered, always flickering in these places, as if electricity itself was uncertain about illuminating what happened here, casting his shadow in stuttering frames against white tiles stained yellow at the edges. Water damage, they'd told him, but Thorne had been here long enough to suspect other sources. The CIA called it Project MKUltra, a name that sounded almost mythological, ancient, though it had been born only months ago from Cold War paranoia and whispered reports of Soviet brainwashing in Korea. American POWs coming home speaking like strangers, their eyes hollow as abandoned houses. Someone had gotten inside their heads, and if they could do it, we needed to do it better. Thorne had believed that once, had believed in a lot of things. Doctor, the voice belonged to his assistant, a young man named Pearson who still wore his optimism like an ill-fitting coat. Subject 23 is ready. Tommy Hale hadn't known his name would become a number. The veteran was 24, with hands that still shook from nightmares about Incheon, and he'd volunteered for what they called a psychological study on stress management. $5 a session. Help advance American medicine. Serve your country one more time. They hadn't mentioned the LSD, of course. That was the thing about MKUltra. Consent was a formality ignored in the name of national security, a luxury America couldn't afford while the Soviets were supposedly perfecting mind control in concrete cells beneath Moscow. The gurney's leather straps creaked as Tommy shifted, his pupils already dilating from the initial dose. Thorne had administered it himself, watching the clear liquid disappear under the young man's skin like a secret being whispered into blood. "How are you feeling, Tommy?" "The walls." Tommy's voice came from somewhere far away, though his body remained still. "They're breathing. Or no, that's not right, they're singing. Do you hear it, doctor, like a lullaby my mother used to?" His words dissolved into something between a laugh and a sob. Thorne leaned closer, pen poised above his notepad, the scientist in him still cataloging, measuring, quantifying human dissolution. "What do the walls sing, Tommy?" "They sing about the colors. God, the colors have names I never knew. Purple sounds like church bells, red tastes like my first kiss. And yellow," his eyes snapped open, meeting Thorne's with an intensity that made the doctor's hand freeze. "Yellow wants me to run." There it was. The dissolution of self, the dismantling of consciousness they'd hoped to understand, to control, to weaponize. But Tommy's face held something Thorne hadn't seen in the previous subjects: recognition. As if in that chemical-induced chaos, he'd glimpsed something true and terrible, some fundamental horror about the nature of minds and who held the keys. "Stay with me, Tommy. You're safe here." "Safe?" The word came out as a whisper, almost pitying. "Doc, nothing's safe, not anymore. They're in the trees, you know, watching from the redwoods. They've always been watching, but now I can see them watching back. The fog isn't fog, it's amnesia. California's amnesia, swallowing everything." Thorne's pen trembled. He'd written hundreds of pages of observations, filled countless files with data that would be sealed in vaults for decades, and he'd done it all with steady hands. But something in Tommy's fractured poetry struck closer to truth than any of his clinical notes. The acrid tang of ether suddenly seemed overwhelming, a chemical curtain between what was happening and what they'd pretend happened in the official reports. In the Haight-Ashbury district, miles away, Other subjects wandered streets they'd known all their lives, suddenly unable to remember their own names, while CIA operatives posed as concerned citizens guiding them to help. Safe houses disguised as apartments. Experiments discu. Essayed as therapy. The city had become a labyrinth, and its minotaur wore a white coat and carried authorization signed by men who'd never have to look into eyes like Tommy's. "I'm going to adjust the dosage," Thorne said, though to whom he couldn't say. The recording device, Pearson hovering by the door, himself perhaps trying to maintain the illusion of control. "It doesn't matter." Tommy's voice had gone quiet, eerily calm. "You can't adjust what's already broken. I can feel my mind coming apart like wet paper, Doc. And you know what the worst part is? Part of me doesn't want it back. Part of me wants to stay in the colors, where Korea doesn't exist and my mother's still alive and nothing hurts anymore because nothing means anything." The fluorescent lights flickered again. Thorne made a notation: subject experiencing ego dissolution and potential dissociative state. Clinical language for a soul coming unmoored. His hands had stopped trembling. That felt worse somehow. As Tommy's murmurs faded into rhythmic breathing, the drug pulling him deeper or offering merciful unconsciousness, Thorne stood alone in that basement laboratory, surrounded by the apparatus of American ambition. Outside, the fog rolled through San Francisco's streets thick as guilt, and somewhere in the redwoods, the wind carried sounds that might have been whispers or might have been nothing at all. But Thorne was starting to suspect that nothing was the most dangerous thing they'd discovered, and that it was already too late to put it back. The word nothing has weight when you're trying to weaponize the human mind. It becomes a presence, a shadow that follows you from basement laboratories to briefing rooms where men in press suits discuss consciousness like it's just another missile system needing calibration. Thorne's realization that they'd unleashed something irretrievable traveled through secure phone lines and classified memos, riding the same winds that carried Tommy's fractured pleas southward, toward the sun-bleached corridors of UC Berkeley, where the machinery of Cold War paranoia ground on, indifferent to individual dissolutions. California in the mid-1950s was a contradiction wrapped in golden light. Hollywood sold dreams on silver screens while government agencies bought nightmares in cash. $25 million, pocket change in the language of contemporary budgets, but a fortune then, funneled through bureaucratic channels into Project MKUltra's sprawling architecture. 149 subprojects. The number itself feels impossible, doesn't it? Each one a separate experiment in human manipulation, scattered across universities, hospitals, prisons, places where vulnerability made people accessible. Where consent was a formality written on forms nobody read, signed by people who didn't understand they were volunteering to have their realities dismantled. Berkeley became another nexus. Professors became contractors. Students became subjects. The campus's revolutionary spirit, all that earnest belief in progress and enlightenment, made perfect cover for research that would have horrified the Enlightenment thinkers those students idolized. In psychology departments, researchers administered substances that had no business near human neurons, then took meticulous notes as those neurons rewired themselves in real time. Science, they called it, patriotic duty. But nowhere did the project's moral vertigo manifest more starkly than in Operation Midnight Climax. Picture this: San Francisco, 1955, fog rolling through streets like amnesia made visible. The Golden Gate Bridge rises above the bay, its cables humming in the wind, a skeletal guardian watching over a city that doesn't know it's become a laboratory. In Telegraph Hill and North Beach, the CIA maintained safe houses disguised as apartments, brothels where sex workers, compensated and complicit, though complicit is complicated when the alternative is arrest, dosed unsuspecting clients with LSD while agents observed through one-way mirrors. The Johns thought they were buying an hour of pleasure. They were actually purchasing admission to their own psychological vivisection. Agent Leela Voss stood in one such room, the mirror cold against her palm as she watched a man on the other side grapple with walls that were melting, a ceiling that breathed. She was 32, recruited from military intelligence where she translated Soviet communications, her facility with language suggesting an aptitude for decoding minds as easily as codes. Sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, The kind of woman who'd had to be twice as competent to earn half the respect in a world of gray-suited men, who thought Y chromosomes came with security clearance. The room where she stood smelled of stale coffee and cigarette ash, the detritus of surveillance. Dossiers covered the table behind her, each one a life reduced to metrics: dosage, duration, observable effects, recovery time, if recovery happened at all. Some subjects never quite returned. They walked around afterward wearing their faces like masks, the person inside gone wandering through landscapes only they could see. The phone rang. Voss answered on the second ring, already knowing who it would be. "We're not monsters, Elias." Her voice came out harder than intended, defensive in that way that betrays doubt. "We're patriots saving the world from itself." Thorne's response crackled through long-distance static. "And what happens when the world realizes what we saved it with?" She had no answer for that. Through the mirror, the man on the other side was weeping now, gentle sobs like a child's, all bravado dissolved along with his sense of self. One of the sex workers, Rosie, hoo-ha. 3 kids and a pension plan that depended on government discretion, sat beside him, murmuring comfort she'd learned to fake convincingly. "The Soviets are." "I know what the Soviets are doing," Thorne interrupted, his voice heavy with something that might have been surrender. "Or what we think they're doing, what we've convinced ourselves they're doing. But Tommy Hale wasn't a Soviet agent, Leela. He was just a kid who survived one war and we drafted him into another without telling him." The line went dead, or Voss hung up. Later she couldn't remember which, and the distinction felt important somehow, like culpability could be measured in who disconnected first. The experiments escalated. At California Medical Facility in Vacaville, prison inmates became subjects in exchange for reduced sentences that never quite materialized. Sensory deprivation tanks submerged men in darkness and silence until their minds, starved for input, began generating their own realities. Hallucinations indistinguishable from perception, proof that consciousness was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Prisoners emerged speaking in fragments, their personalities scattered like puzzle pieces dumped from a box. Some never spoke again at all, just stared at walls with expressions suggesting they'd seen something on the other side of reality that made this side unbearable. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? How innovation birthed such quiet horrors. California was booming: aerospace contracts, suburban sprawl, the promise of endless summers and reinvention. Families moved west chasing American dreams while in classified facilities scattered throughout the state, those dreams were being reverse-engineered into nightmares, tested for military applications. The disconnect was staggering. On one street, children played hopscotch. 3 blocks over, a man who'd volunteered for a stress study couldn't remember his daughter's name. Voss found the journal on a Tuesday. It had been included in a subject's effects after the file said self-terminated, as if death was just another project outcome requiring documentation. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting that degraded as it progressed, coherent sentences fracturing into word salad, then symbols, then something that might have been language from a place language hadn't reached yet. One passage remained readable near the beginning. "They say this will help me. They say I'm serving my country, but I can feel it taking pieces, memories first, then something deeper. If you find this, know that I was here, that I was real, that the colors sang my name before they swallowed it whole." Voss's hands trembled as she read. Behind her, through windows overlooking the bay, California's golden afternoon light painted everything in false warmth. And somewhere in that light, other subjects wandered, carrying fragments of experiments inside them like shrapnel, their echoes pleading to be heard through fog that refused to lift. Those pleas didn't vanish. They couldn't. Sound doesn't truly disappear, it just travels until it finds somewhere to land, and these particular whispers found purchase in the veins of the forgotten, souls adrift in a golden state's hidden mazes. California collected them like a shoreline collects driftwood, pieces of lives broken against rocks nobody bothered naming. They wandered through cities that promised reinvention, carrying experiments inside their skulls like time bombs set to no particular hour, just waiting for the moment when memory would detonate. The fog off the Pacific tastes different when you're looking for ghosts. Salty, yes, but underneath there's something else. The metallic tang of hospital corridors, pharmaceutical residue that never quite washes clean. Lowe's angels in the 1960s sprawled like a fever dream, all palm trees and possibility masking the places where that possibility went to die. The Stanford Research Institute sat in Menlo Park, respectable and academically pristine, its researchers publishing papers on consciousness expansion that carefully omitted certain methodology details. How they fractured identities like glass under pressure. How consent was a word that appeared on forms but never in practice. Declassified documents would later reveal over 1,000 unwitting participants. 1,000. The number should shock, but numbers have a way of becoming abstract at scale, don't they? So let me give you one instead. One name, one face, one life that carries the weight of all those others. Elena Ruiz. She sits on the Venice Beach boardwalk as I find her, or as she finds me. The distinction blurs in stories like these. The waves crash with that particular violence the Pacific reserves for autumn, seaweed and salt spray painting the air thick enough to taste. She's 43 but looks older, the kind of aging that happens from the inside out, consciousness wearing through skin like water through stone. Her eyes are hollow in that specific way that suggests she's seeing more than the visible spectrum allows, tuned to frequencies the rest of us mercifully can't access. Once she was an artist. This matters, not just for narrative symmetry, but because art requires a coherent self, a stable point from which to observe and translate reality. Elena's murals had covered walls from Echo Park to Santa Monica, vibrant explosions of color depicting Aztec goddesses merged with space-age geometry, indigenous memory colliding with California futurism. Magazine profiles called her a visionary. They had no idea how literal that would become. She clutches a photograph, its edges soft from handling. The woman in the picture is recognizably Elena but also not, the same features but animated by presence, by the confidence of someone who knows where her mind's borders are. That Elena smiles at the camera, paint-spattered and radiant. This Elena, the one before me, holds the photo like an artifact from an archaeological dig, evidence of a civilization that no longer exists. "They put stars in my head," she says to no one in particular, though I'm close enough to hear. Her voice has that distant quality of someone speaking through layers of gauze. "But now they're falling. Can you hear them crash?" I can't, but I believe she does. Her story emerges in fragments, the way all shattered things reassemble, incompletal. Why with gaps that ache? In 1963, she'd volunteered for what was described as a creativity enhancement study at a clinic in Westwood. The researchers were affiliated with Stanford, though she didn't know that then. They said the treatment would expand her artistic vision, unlock new dimensions of perception. And it did. God help her, it did. The problem was those dimensions had no doors back. They gave her something. She doesn't remember what. The name itself dissolved along with other certainties. But she remembers the sensation of her consciousness peeling apart like layers of an onion, each one revealing another beneath until there was nothing at the center but confusion and terror so pure it felt like enlightenment. They'd mixed LSD with hypnotic suggestion, fractured her identity, then tried to rebuild it with instructions whispered while she couldn't distinguish self from other, inside from outside. It didn't take, or it took too well, hard to say which is worse. Dr. Thorne came once, she says, and my attention sharpens. After, when they realized something had persisted, he looked at me like I was a mistake he'd made in arithmetic, wrong answer, but the equation itself was still valid. She laughs, but there's no humor in it, just broken glass edges. He asked if I remembered a name, Tommy something. I didn't, I barely remembered my own. The connections web outward from there, sticky and inevitable as spider silk. Thorne had been trying to understand what went wrong with Tommy Hale by examining what went wrong everywhere else. Elena was just another data point in a spreadsheet of shattered psyches, her wandering mind mapped alongside dozens of others, all of them trying to find their way back to selves that no longer had addresses. Voss's name surfaces too, though Elena's memory of her is hazier, a sharp-eyed woman who'd watched through mirrors, taking notes while Elena's reality dissolved. She looked sad, Elena recalls with surprising clarity, like she was mourning something she hadn't killed yet but knew she would. Her murals changed after the experiment. The ones she could still manage to paint turned dark, prophetic, images of figures dissolving into geometric patterns, faces that were also labyrinths, stars falling into skulls that opened like flowers. Other artists called it a bold new direction. She called it documentation. This is what the inside of a fractured mind looks like when translated to pigment and wall. The nostalgic pull is strong here, though maybe nostalgia is the wrong word. Grief, longing. Elena talks about her pre-experiment self with the tender bewilderment of someone describing a deceased relative they'd loved but never quite understood. "I was so certain then," she whispers, the photo trembling in her hands. "So sure of where I ended and the world began. That certainty felt like a prison. Now I'd trade anything for those walls." The falling stars she mentions, they're not metaphors to her. She sees them constantly, traces their descent with her eyes, flinches when they impact against the inside of her skull. Sometimes she tries to catch them, hands grasping at air while tourists give her wide berth, another Venice Beach eccentric they'll mention later as local color. But what if those falling stars illuminated truths too dark to bear? What if the experiments hadn't failed at all, but succeeded in ways the architects never intended, opening doors in consciousness that revealed not Soviet secrets but something older, stranger, infinitely more destabilizing about the nature of self and reality? Those falling stars don't extinguish. They can't. Instead, their light scatters, refracts through the fog that clings to California's coastline like memory clings to trauma, persistent, cold, revealing shapes you'd rather not see. Follow those illuminated paths and you find yourself on Highway 1 in the dead hours, moon hanging fat and indifferent over the Pacific, its light painting the asphalt silver blue. The ocean roars below, constant and meaningless as white noise, as you wind north toward Point Reyes where the land juts into the sea like an accusation. There are bunkers here, abandoned officially, relics from a war that ended, though nobody told the researchers who repurposed them in the late 50s and early 60s, turning coastal defense installations into laboratories for a different kind of warfare entirely. Sensory deprivation chambers carved into concrete thick enough to withstand artillery. Perfect isolation. No light, no sound, just consciousness folding in on itself until it couldn't distinguish between hours and days, between self and absence. The 1977 Senate hearings would eventually expose the breadth of MKUltra's reach, though even then the testimony came wrapped in euphemism and redaction. Over 180 doctors and researchers involved. Experiments conducted on orphans who had no advocates to ask questions. Students promised academic credit. Canadian citizens used in trials that violated international law, their government complicit in erasures that continue to this day. The numbers are documented, verified, unimpeachable. What the documents can't capture is the texture of it, the specific weight of dread in those bunkers, the way darkness becomes something you can taste after enough hours sealed inside it. Your headlights pierce the coastal mist, catching graffiti-scarred walls that emerge from the fog like monuments to forgotten gods. The symbols aren't random, spirals within spirals, eyes that stare from impossible angles, words and languages that might be gibberish or might be the linguistic equivalent of Elena's falling stars, communication from minds that learn to speak in frequencies the rest of us can't parse. Someone has been here recently. The paint is fresh enough to smell. Drive further south, down to Monterey where the pines crowd close to modest cabins and the air smells of resin and regret. This is where I find Thorn A. Gain, though find, suggests intentionality, and really he's just here, inevitable as tides. Older now, weren't we all, isn't everyone in these stories, his hands trembling as he spreads redacted files across a table made from reclaimed driftwood. The irony isn't lost on me, building furniture from storm-tossed debris while sorting through the wreckage of lives. We thought we were mapping the mind, he says, not quite to me, not quite to himself, speaking into that middle distance where confession lives. Cartographers of consciousness, that's how one of the directors described it. Noble work, understanding the final frontier. His finger traces a name on a document, the black bars of redaction making it look like a prisoner behind bars, which I suppose they were. But you can't map a labyrinth while you're lost inside it. And we were lost from the start, stumbling in darkness we'd created, calling our confusion progress. The pine-scented air thickens with something heavier than fog. Regret has a smell, it turns out, like old paper and medication and the specific mustiness of secrets kept too long in closed spaces. But Thorne is yesterday's architect. The story needs someone searching for tomorrow's truth, and that's where Harlan Gray enters, journalist by training, obsessive by nature, inspired by whistleblowers like John Marks who'd spent years chasing paper trails that led to places no official map acknowledged. Gray has been following the breadcrumbs Elena dropped, the connections she couldn't articulate but somehow knew, the way trauma knows things consciousness hasn't caught up to yet. He finds a derelict laboratory in the Oakland Hills, a facility that doesn't appear on any registry but that former orderlies mention in sealed depositions, always with that same faraway look Elena had. The lock on the door is rusted but not destroyed. Inside, the flashlight beam dances across equipment that looks medieval despite being merely decades old. Electroshock machines with leather restraints, sensory deprivation tanks that resemble Iron Maidens, pharmaceutical refrigerators still humming on backup generators someone maintains though no one admits to maintaining. The audio tapes are worst. Gray finds them filed with bureaucratic precision, each labeled with subject numbers rather than names because names make things too human, and this work required clinical distance. He plays one. The voice that emerges sounds like it's been filtered through water and static, a woman pleading for her mother in a language that might be English but might also be something else, syllables warping as she describes visions that blend Cold War paranoia with archetypal terror. "The red telephone is ringing inside my chest," she says, then laughs or screams. The distortion makes it impossible to tell which. But when I answer, it's my own voice asking questions I don't remember learning. Writing this, I feel the weight of those lost echoes settling in my bones. There's a part of me that wants to find redemption in revelation, to believe that dragging these stories into light somehow honors the people who lived them. But that might be wishful thinking. Maybe some things stay dark no matter how bright the flashlight. Still, Gray keeps searching. Has to. The labyrinth doesn't let you leave once you've entered. You can only go deeper, following the thread that always turns out to be a leash pulling you toward the center. And that's where he finds her, another wandering soul, younger than Elena but with that same hollow-eyed distance. She's living in the abandoned lab, treating it like home, because home is just wherever the experiments left you, and this place at least has the honesty of architecture that doesn't pretend to be something other than what it is. "You're looking for the truth," she tells Gray, and her voice has that prophetic quality that comes from having seen too much too young. "But the truth is the labyrinth. There's no exit. There never was. They didn't break us, they just showed us what was already there. The maze inside the mind, infinite and inescapable." Gray's flashlight flickers. In the darkness between beats of light, he swears he can hear footsteps that aren't his own, breathing that multiplies like echoes in a cavern. And in that discovery, the labyrinth's heart beat faster, drawing all into its dread embrace. The labyrinth's heart doesn't quiet once found. Hearts never do. Instead it pulses with accumulated secrets, each beat sending tremors through the fog-veiled landscape until whispers swell into something louder, hungrier, a tempest of voices that howl through California's canyons like wind through a canyon's throat. Gray stands in the Oakland laboratory's darkness, listening to breathing that isn't his, footsteps that multiply into a crowd though he remains alone. Or does he? The wandering soul who made this place home tilts her head, listening to frequencies the rest of us abandoned when we learned to speak in straight lines. "They're coming," she says, and Gray doesn't ask who because he already knows. Everyone involved in this story has been moving toward the same convergence point, drawn by the gravity of revelation like debris spiraling toward a drain. The year is 1973, though time in these narratives has a way of folding back on itself, and we find ourselves in the storm-lashed hills of Big Sur, where the land drops away into the Pacific with geological finality. The church committee won't convene for another 2 years, won't expose MKUltra's breadth until 1975, but already the architects know declassification looms like a thunderhead on the horizon. Already they're destroying records, burning files, ensuring that when the investigations come, and they will come, history has that inexorable quality. There will be nothing but smoke and testimony too fragmented to form a complete picture. But some things refuse to burn, some evidence takes human form. The rain comes horizontal here, driven by Pacific winds that taste of salt and kelp and something older than either. Rain-slicked cliffs gleam like obsidian under a sky the color of bruised fruit. The briny spray stings exposed skin like tears, like penance, and in a hidden grotto accessible only at low tide, lanterns flicker against stone walls that predate the experiments, predate the country itself. This is where they converge. Thorn driven by guilt, Voss by survival, Elena by something she can't name but follows anyway, and Gray because journalists are just archaeologists of the present, digging for truths buried in real time. The leaked tape brew. GHT them here. A high-level confession recorded on equipment meant to monitor subjects, not architects, turned against itself in a moment of poetic justice or cosmic irony, take your pick. Someone wanted this found. Someone always does in the end. The impulse toward revelation proves as strong as the impulse toward concealment, two forces locked in eternal struggle like waves against cliffs. Thorn looks smaller than he did in Monterey, diminished by weather and conscience. Water streams down his face, whether rain or tears or both rendered indistinguishable by the downpour. He confronts Voss among the grotto's shadows, two men who believed they were building something noble, finding themselves instead architects of ruin. We unleashed storms in their minds, Thorn rasps, his voice nearly lost to the wind. Told ourselves we were explorers, pioneers of consciousness, but you can't pioneer what's already inhabited. We were invaders, Voss, colonizers of the psyche, and now the storm comes for us. Voss stands rigid, his face a study in controlled collapse. When he speaks, his voice breaks like ice under pressure. It was for the greater good. You remember, the Soviets had their own programs, their psychic spies and chemical interrogators. This was war, Thorn. Echoes of a war we had to win, even if victory meant sacrificing. He stops, can't finish. What's the acceptable casualty count for the soul? Elena steps forward and despite her fragility, or maybe because of it, she commands the space with the authority of the wounded. Your good left us wandering ghosts, she says, and her voice carries that prophetic quality that comes from having seen behind the veil. We're not casualties of war. We're the war itself, still being fought inside our heads. You didn't defend the nation. You colonized its citizens. This part always chokes me up, I'll admit. The way human frailty transforms guardians into gravediggers. The way noble intentions pave roads to places that have no roads back. Historical documents confirm that MKUltra conducted experiments at the fringes of the Esalen Institute, that California nexus where the human potential movement brushed against something darker, where psychedelics meant to expand consciousness became tools for dismantling it, where therapy and torture shared techniques, distinguished only by intention, and sometimes not even that. The grotto holds memories of these intersections. Covered-up deaths like Frank Olson's infamous fall from a New York hotel window in 1953, though here in this mythic geography we find the metaphor transplanted to California's cliffs, where the drop is just as fatal and twice as poetic. Bodies in the fog. Minds pushed past breaking points and beyond. The church committee would eventually document 25 deaths connected to MKUltra, but numbers never capture the texture of loss, the specific weight of a life extinguished in the name of national security. Yet tangled with the horror comes nostalgia, strange and bittersweet. Flashes of 1950s optimism, grainy as old film stock, when Americans believed in the boundless frontier, space, the atom, the mind itself, all territories waiting to be conquered, mapped, understood. We were so young then as a nation, so convinced that every problem had a solution if we just applied sufficient ingenuity and will. The space race promised stars, instead we got psychic voids. The promise of understanding consciousness gave us labyrinths with no exit. They burn the evidence there in the grotto, feeding documents to a fire that hisses and spits in the humid air. The last physical proof turning to ash and smoke that the wind carries out to sea. But Elena and the others, the wandering souls, they're evidence that can't be destroyed. Living testimony written in neural pathways and trauma responses, in nightmares that loop like broken records. The whispers crescendo into a roar as the fire builds, voices of all the subjects blending into a chorus that sounds like accusation, like grief, like warning. Gray records what he can, knowing that documentation is the only weapon against erasure, however blunt. Yet in the storm's eye, nostalgia clung like mist, pulling souls toward a resolution as haunting as the fog itself. But resolution, we learn, is just another word for acceptance, accepting that some echoes don't shatter when the storm passes. They linger. They find homes in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pauses between breaths, in the melancholic void where memory and imagination blur into something that might be truth or might be the story we tell ourselves to survive the truth. The 1980s arrive with the subtlety of dawn after a long night. California's redwoods stand as silent sentinels under a starlit sky, their branches sighing like the exhalations of weary giants who have witnessed too much, kept too many secrets in their rings. The counterculture that bloomed here in the 60s has aged into something gentler, sadder, a generation reckoning with the gap between the utopia they imagined and the reality they inherited. The Summer of Love, we understand now, was an unwitting echo of MKUltra's experiments, both seeking transcendence through chemistry, both discovering that the mind's doors, once opened, don't always close the way you expect. The lawsuits came in the 70s, victims and their families seeking acknowledgement if not recompense. Compensation checks arrived like blood money, amounts that could never balance the equation. Among the cases, threads connecting to individuals who would later become infamous, the Unabomber's brother pursuing legal remedies, his sibling already wandering in labyrinths of his own making. California's role in the program's legacy manifests in abandoned laboratories scattered through the Sierra foothills, structures now overgrown with vines and blackberry brambles, nature reclaiming what humans tried to hide. These ruins are not dramatic, no crumbling Gothic architecture here, just concrete bunkers slowly being swallowed by green, symbols of buried truths that refuse to stay buried. Elena has become something between survivor and specter, a mentor to younger people who carry similar fractures in their psyches, though their origins differ. Trauma has its own language, recognizes its own speakers. She gathers with Gray in a moonlit clearing where the earthy scent of damp moss mingles with wood smoke. Where fireflies dance like errant thoughts made luminous. The campfire crackles, embers popping softly, illuminating faces weathered by time and truth. She's aged in the way people do when they've lived multiple lifetimes in one body, her eyes holding galaxies of pain but also something like wisdom, if wisdom can coexist with wounds that never fully heal. The whispers never left, Elena murmurs, watching the fire. Her voice has that quality of distance, as if she's speaking from somewhere else even while sitting right here. They just became part of the wind, nostalgic ghosts in this labyrinth we call California. Gray sits with his notebook, pen poised but motionless. He's been documenting this story for years now, accumulating fragments, and still the full picture eludes him. Maybe that's the nature of labyrinths. They're not meant to be mapped from above but experienced from within. But writing them down, he says, and there's something almost desperate in the question, does it free us? The fire shifts, and in its movement a figure seems to materialize, or maybe it's just shadow and imagination, memory projected onto smoke. Thorn, looking as he did in the grotto but somehow more transparent, more ghostly. Elena doesn't seem surprised. Gray has stopped questioning these apparitions. The line between hallucination and haunting has always been thinner than we pretend. Freedom, Thorn's voice comes from everywhere and nowhere. We were the wanderers all along. You think you're documenting us, Gray, but you're just joining the labyrinth from a different entrance. It's oddly beautiful, isn't it, how scars can bloom into stories? How the worst chapters of history can transform into narratives that, if not redemptive, are at least illuminating. Elena traces patterns in the dirt with a stick, geometric shapes that might be maps or might be nothing, symbols that mean everything or nothing depending on who's looking. She's told Gray about the before times, the fragments she retains from pre-experiment days. A mother's lullaby. The taste of blackberry pie on a summer afternoon. The feeling of possibility that permeated the 50s if you were the right kind of person in the right kind of place, before the decade's darkness revealed itself. The counterculture tried to heal what MKUltra broke, though neither side knew they were engaged in the same conversation. Haight-Ashbury's seekers pursuing consciousness expansion, while CIA subjects fled from unwanted expansions of their own. The irony would be funny if it weren't so tragic. Wonder and ruin, dancing together in California's soil like fireflies in the darkness. The fire builds and something hallucinatory overtakes the scene, or maybe Gray is finally seeing what Elena has seen all along. Faces emerge in the flames, subjects whose names he's uncovered in his research, people who vanished into the program and never quite returned. They merge and separate, their features blending like watercolors in rain. Some he recognizes: the graduate student from Stanford, the jazz musician from San Francisco, the drifter who thought he was volunteering for a sleep study. Others remain anonymous, their stories lost to destroyed files and fading memories. But the horror softens gradually the way dawn softens night. The faces in the flames don't accuse, they witness, they testify. And in their testimony, something like peace, or at least cessation of the worst pain, becomes possible. Elena reaches over and closes Gray's notebook. "Some things resist documentation," she says gently. "Some whispers need to stay whispers." Thorne's apparition fades with the firelight, or maybe he was never there. Maybe he's always there for those who know how to look. The distinction matters less than we think. And as the fire dimmed, the whispers resolved into a haunting silence, where souls might finally rest or wander eternal. The distinction in the end matters less than the wandering itself, because silence isn't absence, it's just whispers spoken in a language we've forgotten how to hear, fading into California's eternal twilight where fog and memory become indistinguishable, where resolution dissolves like mist at dawn, present but impossible to grasp. Time performs its slow alchemy. We arrive at the present, 2025, driving the Pacific Coast Highway as golden hour light filters through eucalyptus groves, their peeling bark like pages torn from classified documents. The wind here carries something beyond salt and kelp. It carries echoes softened by decades, sirens that once wailed through the 60s now reduced to the gentlest suggestion, a frequency you feel more than hear. The waves lap against cliff faces with the rhythm of breathing, patient and eternal, dissolving distant echoes into ambient silence that feels almost like peace. The 2019 declassifications revealed what survivors already knew: that psychological legacies don't obey statutes of limitations, that trauma compounds across generations like interest on a debt nobody remembers taking out. California's MKUltra sites have undergone their own strange transformation. The hidden basements beneath San Francisco's North Beach district now host haunted tourists paying to shiver in the same rooms where subjects once shivered for very different reasons. It would be grotesque if it weren't so quintessentially Californian. This ability to commodify even our darkest chapters, to turn horror into curiosity, to make entertainment from anguish. But maybe that's a kind of healing too, or maybe it's just forgetting with better marketing. Gray sits on a cliffside bench, elderly now, his notebook weathered as driftwood beside him. The Pacific stretches to the horizon, vast and indifferent, beautiful in its refusal to remember or care about human dramas played out along its shores. He's been coming here for years, though he can't quite articulate why. The sea doesn't answer questions. It just continues its ancient conversation with the shore, the same argument repeated endlessly with slight variations, like trauma working itself through in therapy. Elena's spirit, or is it just memory given form by solitude and longing, sits beside him. She looks as she did that night by the campfire, or maybe younger or maybe ageless. The dead don't age, and neither do our recollections of them, suspended in amber moments while we continue forward into decay. Did we ever escape the labyrinth? Gray asks the horizon, and it's unclear whether he's speaking to Elena, to himself, or to the wind that might carry words to wherever wandering souls listen. The whisper that comes back could be imagined, could be wind through cypress branches, could be the neural patterns of an aging mind filling silence with meaning. We became it. And isn't that the truth of it? The labyrinth was never just the facilities, the experiments, the programs. It was always California itself, this place where dreams and nightmares grow in the same soil, where seekers and lost souls arrive believing they'll find answers and instead find better questions. The MKUltra subjects didn't escape the labyrinth because the labyrinth wasn't a place you left. It was a pattern you carried, a way of seeing the world where every corner might hide a door, every door might open onto another corridor, endlessly recursive, infinitely disorienting. Flashback montages rise like fog from Gray's memory, Thorne in the grotto reaching for stars in the ceiling. Voss at his desk, face illuminated by lamplight, the moment his certainty cracked and doubt seeped in like water through concrete. Their regrets dissolve into the coastal fog, not forgiven but absorbed, made part of the atmosphere. We breathe the ghosts of other people's mistakes. We exhale our own, contributing to the air that future generations will inherit. The ozone scent of an approaching storm mingles with eucalyptus, that peculiar California smell that signals change and continuity simultaneously. The dread that permeated the earlier parts of this story gives way to something harder to name, not quite peace, but a kind of ambiguous acceptance. The horror of what was done to Elena and the others remains, but it's tempered now by nostalgia for the innocence that preceded it, the belief that progress and science only moved us forward, never sideways or into darker territories we weren't ready to navigate. There are no tidy bows here. No moment where Gray closes his notebook with satisfaction, where Elena's ghost smiles and fades, where we're told that documenting the trauma healed it. Some wounds don't close, they just become part of the landscape we inhabit, familiar enough to navigate around but never quite forgettable. The wandering souls echo in us all. In every moment we question our own perceptions. In every instance we wonder if our thoughts are truly our own or products of forces we can't fully see. Ending this, I feel a pull as if the whispers themselves are urging one last listen. Not for answers, those remain as elusive as ever, but for acknowledgement. The subjects of MKUltra didn't ask to become myth, didn't volunteer to be the ghosts that haunt California's psychological landscape. They were people, ordinary, flawed, hopeful people, who found themselves in circumstances that transformed them into something else. Symbols, warnings, reminders. Gray stands, leaving the notebook on the bench. Maybe someone else will find it, add their own observations, continue the documentation that never quite documents, the story that resists easy telling. Elena's presence, real or imagined, lingers a moment longer, then dissipates like morning fog under a rising sun. The Pacific continues its eternal conversation. The eucalyptus trees sigh. Somewhere in San Francisco, tourists descend basement stairs to shiver at stories they don't fully understand. And in California's mind-control labyrinths, the souls still wander, their echoes a reminder that some mysteries are meant to haunt, not heal. That some whispers should stay whispers. That some labyrinths have no exit because they were never meant to be escaped, only traversed, experienced, survived. And the wind carries it all away, softly into twilight,